make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
You just can't go anywhere without somebody talking about Christian nationalism now. That wasn't the case 6 or 7 years ago when we started writing about this. Like, most everybody was just like, that's not a thing. That's just, you made that up. It's something that as it becomes more popular, there is a risk, a real risk, that it becomes this empty slur category that just means any person to the right of me, or anybody who's engaged in politics, any Christian, any conservative Christian.
Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
And this week we have with us the one, the only Samuel Perry, who is an award-winning scholar and teacher. He's among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, family, sexual behavior. And I didn't know this. You've been recognized as among the top sociologists in the world in terms of research, productivity, and impact. You've authored like 100 peer-reviewed articles, have authored a number of different books, two of which I cannot recommend enough, called Taking America Back for God, which you wrote with Andrew Whitehead, and The Flag and the Cross with Philip Gorski. And you have a new book, I guess, coming out soon, which I'd love to kind of talk more about as we kind of move on. So welcome to the show, Samuel.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, guys. It's my privilege.
Yeah. So I guess just to kind of dig right into it, I was brought to the attention of your work in my study of Christian nationalism. It seems like you can't really go very far without seeing your name on a peer-reviewed paper or a book or a forward or whatever, without seeing your name. So I just want to ask, like, what is it that got you into this field? Like, what is it about Christian nationalism as a whole that's kind of made you the sort of preeminent expert?
I think the thing that got me into sociology originally was I'm fascinated by the connection between Christianity and culture in the United States. So in all kinds of ways. Like, I think since I was in college, I worked for a college ministry. I'm a Christian, and I'm very much a part of my church and my faith community. But I think I've always been fascinated by the ways that the Christian religion becomes a part of whatever culture it happens to be in, oftentimes in really imperceptible ways, to where it's difficult to disentangle what aspect of what I'm looking at here is Christianity in any kind of like core sense, and what aspect of it is like a cultural accretion from the context in which it happens to be in. So, for example, it could be, American Christianity's kind of individualism with respect to other expressions of Christianity around the world. Well, that's obviously something that's just American, right? Like, it's just a part of American independence and individualism that isn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily core to like the biblical understanding of Christianity, at least not as I understand it in the New Testament. So I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by the ways I grew up in an interracial family. And so I was always fascinated with the ways that, Christian understandings of race and how Christianity has been implicated in the story of American race relations, oftentimes in really unfortunate ways. And I was just always fascinated with, like, how did that happen? How did it happen to where you have this large population of people who thought, racial distinctions were somehow biblical, or that they were good, or some should be upheld, and racial supremacy and all those kinds of things. I'm fascinated to where people could argue that was something that was a part of the Christian religion, that was something that they found in the Bible. So all that to say, I think my fascination with the ways that culture and Christianity intersect naturally led into this understanding of Christian nationalism. How could we actually see our own political influence and power as a part of the Christian story? That God somehow has this mythical relationship with the United States, that we were founded in some kind of a biblical, like, Christian, there's somehow some kind of a that our story is a part of like the story of Christianity in a way that like means something for Christianity too, right? Like we have a role to play in this rather than some footnote in the story. Like we have a bigger role in that, or that it is the Christian's obligation to win the country for God as a nation, not just as individuals. Like this is a part of that ideology. And so I'm deeply fascinated by, as an academic, I'm fascinated as an intellectual enterprise and just what makes people think that. How does it shape our political activity and shape the ways that we make this a freer or not so free country? What are the consequences for everything else? I mean, I think it weaves together.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, part of like the Christian nationalism debate, is that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and I've always felt like because of Christianity's relationship to Jim Crow, slavery, polygenesis, like you just name it, and like, do we really want to like have our Christian faith be connected? Like if we sort of play out logically, like, okay, this was founded as a Christian nation. Oh yeah, but Christians have done some pretty awful stuff. Right. I don't really know if I really want that kind of like connection to my faith.
Well, and so even making that claim requires a couple of things. It requires you, one, to do some kind of a no true Scotsman thing where we just try to pretend that all those people who are a part of that, Jim Crow and slavery, weren't real Christians, which backs you into a corner because it's like, well, we're talking Jonathan Edwards wasn't a real Christian and George Whitefield wasn't a real Christian, and basically every person in the South was not a real, like, do we really want to say that? Or and at the same time, it requires us, so that's one hand, we have to say that those people weren't real Christians. On the other end of that, we have to somehow talk about how that wasn't really that bad at all, right? Like, so maybe Christian masters were good to their slaves. Like, we have to kind of get ourselves into those conversations about like how maybe slaves liked it or something like that. And rather than just acknowledge that, like, hey, that's Christianity has had an unfortunate relationship with in a lot of unwise and tragic ways with evil powers that have been a part of that, and it's okay to recognize that, repent of it, try to correct those errors, but to try to claim that we have always and shall be this kind of shining city on a hill for Jesus is a really problematic thing. Yeah.
Are you saying that
Yes.
like black people didn't receive important like job vocational skills as slaves? We should be thankful, right?
Yeah, it's so funny, man. It is a very difficult thing to think about the history of Christianity, the ways in which Christians have done things that we would look at today and be really appalled. And all of us kind of think rightly so. How do you handle that tension, like between taking yourself to an objective place and looking at this history of Christianity, looking at how it's been entangled in politics, essentially from the beginning of our nation, and even obviously way before that? It was always there's a sense of it being entangled, except maybe in the first couple hundred years of the Christ movement, when they were not necessarily they didn't have the kind of power that they started to gain in the Roman Empire. How do you, as a sociologist and a historian, because those skills, they have overlap there. How do you separate yourself, being on one hand a Christian and trying to look at it, understanding like, hey, these are, in some sense, right, from a Christian faith, these are part of my brethren. Like, these are people that I'm going to see potentially in heaven, or however that works, right? And then yet at the same time, you have to take an objective look and say, hey, like, this is unacceptable. These things that have happened, this kind of entanglement. How have you handled that tension in your studies?
Yeah, so I think it on the one hand, like, and my own personal, like, I come from a Reformed tradition, and so I'm like a PCA Presbyterian, grown up in that context, and so I'm very much And I'm a part of a loosely affiliated SBC church here in Norman, which I'm more Reformed Baptist. I think it's my understanding of humans, and that includes Christians, that we're just deeply broken people, right? Like we are prone to deception, that the heart is deceitful, that we'll talk ourselves into just about anything when group pressure and identity and all of that team psychology or various kinds of things that we get swept up in can deceive us and make us think that. I don't think that's inherent to Christianity. I don't think it has to be. So like I'm not a part of team like religion is corrupt and always and forever part of power and that it has to be that. I think there is something in the Christian tradition that I think can be antithetical to that kind of claim, those kind of grabs, right? Like I think the life of Christ, I think the early church. I mean, Josh, I think you made a great point that in the early church, I was, and I see Wallace on your bookshelf behind you. I tutored for advanced Greek grammar in Wallace's Greek class at Dallas Seminary.
That's awesome.
I loved my experience there. But my understanding of the New Testament church was that suffering and persecution were a part of discipleship. That was a part of like what made you a Christian. As I read Irenaeus and as I read the Apostolic Fathers, I see that these people, and I read Paul, frankly, in Philippians 3, and I mean, these guys, Colossians 1, they really did think a part of the gospel message, part of gospel living was embracing suffering. That was a part of discipleship. And so the cross is a part of the Christian life. And so I think that comes with that a recognition that we are broken, that we can acknowledge that we are imperfect, that people who have had the name of Christian have been imperfect, and that we are trying to follow imperfectly the example of Jesus and what he lived out for us. And so I think that means we don't have to be afraid. Like we don't have to be afraid to recognize areas in which we have just been flawed and made horrible, horrible mistakes, assuming we're willing to rectify those situations as best we can. And that can be through policy, it can be through personal activism, it can be all of the above. But I don't share that kind of reluctance to dive into those mistakes and to say like, look, that was a horrible time and we just really missed it, and just what a tragic kind of thing. I think that allows us to kind of redeem the witness rather than try to like pretend it didn't happen or explain it away or that. And so I guess that's personally how I try to handle my part in that.
That's really cool. Redeeming the witness. I'm gonna have to remember that, because like that's a really cool like
absolutely
phrase. And as you're talking, I was thinking we've spoken to Tremper Longman III on a couple occasions, and he wrote this really phenomenal book, the Bible and the Bible and the Ballot. I always get it confused because like so Caitlin Chess wrote a book of like the opposite, and you switch. It's like the ballad and the Bible, anyways. But in Tremper's book, he wrote, he was addressing like Christian persecution, and he talks about that. He's just like, yeah, that's kind of what you sign up for, like when you're sort of signing up to be persecuted. So like going out and complaining about it really sort of like defeats the purpose of your salvation a little bit. And I just thought that was so powerful. But I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and just have you maybe define some terms that we will obviously be talking about here. One term is Christian nationalism. And maybe after you're done defining what that is, maybe help us kind of understand some of the metrics that are used to determine what is Christian nationalism. I know that like in your book and even like with the PRI survey, there's terms like adherents and rejectors and sympathizers and stuff. And I know that the terms differ a little bit than how you've defined them. So I'd love for you to just kind of get into that.
Yeah. Sure. And this is, I just want to say like, this is really important. I enjoy having these conversations about defining those terms, because I think this is really, the word itself is like, you just can't go anywhere without somebody talking about Christian nationalism now. That wasn't the case 6 or 7 years ago when we started writing about this. Like, most everybody was just like, that's not a thing. That's just, you made that up. It's something that as it becomes more popular, there is a risk, a real risk, that it becomes this empty slur category that just means any any person to the right of me, or anybody who's engaged in politics, any Christian, any conservative Christian, which is, if you've read the two books, you know that we've actually said from the beginning in the preface, even, like, that's not what we mean. That's not what we're trying to do. We've never wanted to do that. We always want to define our terms carefully, because we do think, like, I don't think Christian nationalism is the same as Christian patriotism. I think those are different things. I don't think Christian nationalism is the same as being a white evangelical. I think those are different things, right? So, like, defining our terms really helps us have a productive conversation. So what is it? Christian nationalism, we define in Taking America Back as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. Whenever I say Christianity there, I always want to put an asterisk by Christianity, because I don't mean a fusion of American civic life with just kind of like being a disciple of Jesus, or that, like, you have made Jesus the Lord and Savior of your life. I mean, Christianity is culture, and really is an ethnoculture, pretty much like an This is why we call it white Christian nationalism. I'll get into that in a second. Christian nationalism, as we usually see it, has in mind the institutionalization and preservation and basically supremacy of a very particular kind of Christianity, or an expression, and that is usually kind of indistinguishable from what we might call, like, conservative Anglo-Protestantism, or an Anglo-Protestant tradition. A great book by Brian Miller called The Religion of American Greatness. He goes into this kind of, I think he does a great job. It's a phenomenal book. I recommend it to everybody. And he takes Christian nationalism from a more philosophical and theological, political philosophy, and a more theological kind of understanding, rather than as a social scientist. But I think this is the understanding that the Christianity in mind is kind of an Anglo-Protestantism. It's not the Christianity of the Black Church. It's not the Christianity of Latino Roman Catholics. It's largely white evangelicalism is what we're talking about here. That is what we mean. Now, why do we call it white Christian nationalism? This is also important, because I think we have moved towards calling it that more often, because what we find, and we didn't call it that just to make it sound scary or racist. The reason we call it that is because in study after study, and we show this in the Flag and the Cross as well, we find that the more Americans, when white Americans affirm our various questions about Christian nationalism, they seem to have something completely different in mind than when, say, Black Americans do so, or Latinos. When white Americans affirm our measures of Christian nationalism, they seem to have in mind nostalgia, group boundaries, the idea that America rightfully belongs to certain people and that needs to be preserved, authoritarian forms of social control. When people of color affirm those same indicators, they seem to have something in mind that is more like we understand American civil religion, this kind of aspirational idea that America has a stewardship, that we have been given these divine blessings, and that we have a responsibility to uphold equality, justice, the things that would make our country great, or we're going to have that blessing taken away. That seems to be like what African-American people of color have in mind there. So what we're really talking about is we're talking about kind of an Anglo-Protestant Christian nationalism. So it's a white Christian nationalism. It's a Christian nationalism that white Americans seem to have in mind. So yeah, I think that is, and in Flag and the Cross, we talk about how white Christian nationalism includes both a deep story of America's past, this kind of mythological connection that we have with the Christian God, and a vision for its future, this outlook that says America should always be distinctively Christian in this way, and therefore it's incumbent on the followers of Jesus or Christians or whoever to restore the supremacy of Christian culture. That includes both the values, but also frankly the institutional recognition. Right, that let's make this formal. Let's make this something that we actually recognize both in our laws and even for some people, even the people that we elect. In very extreme forms of this, like in Stephen Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, he outright argues that non-Christians should not hold public office, that they will not have the same political equality that you and I have. That's extreme. I don't think that's necessarily everybody who subscribes to this thinks that. I think, but that is consistent with the logic of Christian nationalism. So that's, I think, we can talk about it that way too.
Yeah, interestingly enough, we've actually had Stephen on the program, and he talked about his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. And when we asked him about that in particular, he didn't necessarily, it didn't seem to me he was as strong on it as he is in the book, which was kind of interesting. It's like you kind of, because we're like, wait, so if you're Muslim, like you wouldn't be able to run for office. It was something like to that extent. And it was like, well, not necessarily, but you couldn't do anything against like Christian, norms or anything like that. So it's funny because it's such a, I mean, I never even heard of this years ago, like you said, but of course, this didn't just pop into existence out of nowhere. Right. This Christian nationalism, this fervor, and this combining of Christian ideals and norms with political power, especially in America. And of course, I'm thinking specifically about America. Can you trace a line like from the Declaration of Independence, or to today, and kind of hit major areas where to your understanding, like this, like where did this come from? How is this here in our nation? How has it gone up at times, down at times? Has it always just been there under the surface, just waiting? Help us understand why we are here today, because I think understanding the major narrative helps us and helps people who don't really think of it as, maybe in super negative terms. So they might think, I've said this several times when we talked about it, I have friends that I love and highly respect that like say, well, Christian and nationalism, neither of those sound that bad to me. I'm a Christian, I'm a patriot, and you kind of alluded to it before, but help even just like even more the finer distinctions here to help us understand why this is such a problematic thing, and that we need to be thinking about it and talking about it and openly, making efforts to make sure that it doesn't grow any more than it already has.
Yeah, so I think what we talk about in the flag and the cross, we try to, and this was our attempt in taking America Back for God. We really keyed in on what was going on right now. We looked at survey data and just tried to trace it within. We didn't go any later than 2007 or like any earlier than 2007, just survey data that we had.
Gotcha.
But we wanted to take seriously what had been a pretty fair critique among historians, is that like, look, what you're pointing to is really old. It's not something that just kind of came on the scene. You need to recognize about how this has really been a part of American history. And so Phil Gorski, who's just a brilliant historical sociologist, what we talk about in the flag and the cross, led by Phil in those sections, is that white Christian nationalism is older than the nation itself. We have always had some kind of it when we were colonies, right? Like just trying to figure out who this nation rightfully belonged to. There was an assumption that was something like Christian nationalism. We wouldn't have called it there, but it would have been something like Anglo-Protestant Britishism, right? Like who the nation belongs to, and in some ways that conflated religion. It wasn't Catholics, and it certainly wasn't Native Americans, whatever they believed, which we thought, they were thought at the time not to believe anything. And so it would have been Protestant, it would have been Anglo. It's not the French, it's not these other people. And it would have been, or like white, it would have been like not the red American or people of color. So it would have been Anglo, it would have been Protestant, it would have been British, right? Like it's not the other nations. It belongs to us. And so ethnicity, religion, and nation all like were merged in this kind of like who the nation belongs to and who gets what we talk about the liberty, order, and violence, right? Like the liberty, we get the liberty to order society as we want it to. Everybody else gets the order, and if they step out of line, they get the violence. And we're justified in using this kind of righteous violence. So white Christian nationalism in some form, it's changed over time because like it's always a different bad guy. Sometimes it's like the French, sometimes it's the Native Americans, sometimes it's African Americans, sometimes it's Asian Americans, right? Like it's whoever the immigrants or whoever. It's and so it has ebbed and flowed throughout Americans' history in response to perceptions of cultural and political threat. And so whenever we see this kind of a question in mind of who the nation rightfully belongs to, and that is kind of up for grabs culturally. You see white Christian nationalism and that kind of thing unites largely white Americans around who are we as a people? Who does the nation belong to? And it's a way you can circle the cultural wagons and rally people to your political, I think, influence. And so you see this. You see this certainly throughout. The beginning years of the American Revolution, and especially latter around, say, like the early 1800s, when we're thinking about who we are as a nation. We're developing a nationalism, a sense of who Americans are. We see it emerge during, say, right before the Civil War, when we have the emergence of like the Know Nothing Party, where the Know Nothing Party is anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. It's very much about like, no, the real Americans are white Anglo Protestant, it's white Protestant people who are nativists, people who are born here. We see the same responses to kind of the Catholic invasion of Italians and Irish, and as Kevin Kruse has shown in his book. Oh gosh, why am I blanking this? Kevin Kruse, One Nation Under God.
Yeah.
And in the early half of the 1900s, Kevin Kruse talks about like how another emergence of white Christian nationalism in response to communism and in response to the threat of Cold War required this escalating sense that America is a Christian nation, that it is a capitalist nation. It is about liberty and it is about freedom for these groups of people. So I think white Christian nationalism ebbs and flows throughout America. It's always there, but it ebbs and flows and throughout history in response to perceptions of cultural and political those who have historically held power. Now think about it in this context today. What's going on right now? Well, you've got two straight elections where you lose to Barack Obama. You've got all of this talk of ethnic transition, of demographic transition, which is real. So like we don't deny that. Like America is becoming less white. America is becoming less Christian. There are real demographic transitions that conservative Christians, especially white Americans, have to grapple with. And I think a response to that has been this idea that we should lean into national identity, ethnoculture, who America rightfully belongs to. This is ours, not theirs. And so we've actually seen this in experimental studies. Some social psychologists that I work with, Mara Alkire and Mikey Pasek, and some social psychologists around the country, they ran an experiment where they told a group of Christians they randomly assigned them to receive this kind of treatment, this exposure to this message. And they told a group of Christians that they were going to be the minorities. They reminded them that they're going to be the minorities by 2050, and some Pew study or whatever. And they found that when you told a group of Christians about their impending minority status, they responded with greater Christian nationalism and greater Trump support. And so in that study, I think they were able to show that, like, look, Christian nationalism in many ways is a response to a perceived loss, a threat of cultural and political influence that you want to fight against, right? That makes you feel uncomfortable. And so I think that's how we understand it. I think it is a very real and sincere response to the perception that something is being taken away from you. If you read Stephen Wolf's book, it drips with that kind of understanding that this country we are losing our ethnic and religious heritage and history. This is something that we should be manly about and take back and make sure that it can never happen. And again, I think Stephen Wolf I'm not trying to paint every person who subscribes to any form of this as Stephen Wolf. I don't think that. I think it's an extreme. But I do think it's consistent with the logic of this kind of ideology. It's just taken to the unapologetic nth degree in Stephen Wolf's work.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I should add, when we spoke with Stephen Wolf, I mean, super nice guy, very professional. We obviously disagree on a lot of the fundamental stuff that he had in his book, but he was nice enough to come on our show and talk to a bunch of people that disagreed with him. So, hey, kudos to him. Right. But,
right.
I do want to kind of maybe circle back because it's sort of relevant, given just the last thing you said about how do we know if somebody, is an adherent to Christian nationalism?
Sure. Right.
Like what are the sort of benchmarks that we use?
Yeah, thanks for circling back to that. I think this is where I think this is the science part of what we're doing. And when I say the science part, I just mean the science in that the ways that we try to measure things are always imperfect and developing over time. And so this is why I like being a social scientist, is like when you do honest work, you can really just say and acknowledge that certain measures could be improved, and here's how we're trying to improve them, and here's how we're trying to zero in on the thing that we're talking about. So when we wrote the book, Taking America Back for God, we used a set of questions, six item a question or a scale. And that it used how much you agree with various statements like the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, which is a pretty explicitly Christian nationalist statement. And other questions that were something like the federal government should advocate Christian values. We asked Americans how much they agree that the federal government should enforce a strict separation of church and state. And we reverse coded that so that the more Christian nationalist answers, you don't want a separation of church and state, in other words. And then we asked other questions like the success of the United States as part of God's plan. The federal government should allow prayer in public schools, and the federal government should allow the religious symbols in public spaces. So that was the first questionnaire that we used. And in our book, Taking America Back for God, we divided responses into 4 categories. We had rejectors, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors. And we really did that, honestly, we did that so that people could kind of get a handle on, rather than saying people scored a 12 on our Christian nationalism scale, we could say that these people are basically like low-scoring accommodators, something like that. And we did that as a heuristic device. Like we have not ever used that in any kind of peer-reviewed papers. Like we did that for the book as a heuristic device so people could get handles on it. I think people have misunderstood that in some way as to where like there are these kind of genuine clinical concepts or categories that like I'm an ambassador and I'm an accommodator. We don't throw around those labels. I don't go around calling people that. I still talk about Christian nationalism as a spectrum that can exist on a scale, right? And honestly, I don't go around calling people Christian nationalists because I think it shuts down the conversation as kind of a negative sounding word. We have since developed new questions that I think are far more specific. Now we ask questions on our most recent surveys in the last 2 years. We ask questions about whether Americans feel like it is a Christian's responsibility to take dominion over the institutions of culture and education and media. We ask them whether the Bible ought to be the foundation of American law. We ask them whether they believe the founding documents were divinely inspired. Whether they believe that God has a special plan for the United States, right? Like, so we're basically trying to tap into that deep story and very specific ideas about the future. So I think this is how we try to zero in on who is more or less a Christian nationalist. But again, I don't like calling people Christian nationalists as if that's a firm category. It's not a clinical diagnosis, as if somebody has like depression or something. Like it is a spectrum that people can exist on, and they can be people who completely reject it. They can be somewhere in the ambiguous middle where most Americans are, and they can be people who are completely sold on that idea. And our names about these things, adherents and sympathizers that PRI uses, those are just ways to have like heuristic devices that people can kind of get their minds around, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Is the dominion question like relevant because of like the New Apostolic Reformation stuff, the 7 mountains? Like, is that an intentional sort of like use of the word dominion?
I think we're trying to get at that. Most people who subscribe to Christian nationalism are in fact premillennial, lean, charismatic. Like it's not like Stephen Wolfe is PCA, and so like he's reformed. Like, and there is this small pocket of like the Doug Wilson, Stephen Wolfe, like reformed folks. But you could, I mean, in my opinion, I think you could hold a conference with all of the deeply reformed Christian nationalists in a McDonald's in Norman somewhere. Like it's not a huge group of people. They're very prominent and very like loud, but I think where you're getting the most numbers of people who subscribe to Christian nationalism is you're getting them among holiness traditions, probably a lot of Southern Baptist, charismatic Pentecostals. That we show that in the flag and the cross. Like the people who score the highest on our Christian nationalism scale in the flag and the cross are Pentecostal, holiness, Southern Baptist, white evangelicals as a group, and that kind of thing. It's most of the PCA people that I know of are not buying into some kind of dominionist idea, or even Christian. I mean, also because like Christian nationalism is associated with like, frankly, PCA people tend to be educated, well-to-do folks who are working upper middle class or upper class jobs. And in study after study after study, we find Christian nationalism is negatively associated with education and negatively associated with income. And so the people who really subscribe to this ideology are far more likely to be people you'll find in charismatic Pentecostal holiness kind of traditions, NAR, yes. But they're more likely to be, say, like white working class Americans who subscribe to that rather than lawyers and doctors in some PCA church in Augusta, Georgia.
Interesting. I'm curious. So you, Whitehead, you guys have done a lot of just your own, statistics, your surveys. Like how did it comport with a lot of the data that like PRI and Brookings did on their sort of major study? And I know they just came out with another one about Christian nationalism in like the 50 states. How does your data compare to like their data? Is it pretty similar?
Yeah, I think it's entirely consistent. It's if you are, the way you could point to inconsistencies is just simply how we categorize different groups, right? Like, and those are almost arbitrary decisions, like about where you put the cutoff is like who scores a what on which scale. Like this is where it gets a little bit messy. And so like what does our ambassador category look like compared to the adherence category that PRI uses? Like we're not making those comparisons again. Like we just use that for like a heuristic device in the book. We don't want to reify that as if this kind of concept. But what you want to pay attention to, and this is what I try to tell people, what you want to pay attention to is the association. How do the things that PRI measures and Pew has measured and the Baylor Religion Survey has measured and the General Social Survey has measured, how do these things correlate to various other political attitudes and behaviors? And we find that the correlation is quite strong, right? It is very consistent. That people who subscribe to Christian nationalism, especially white Americans, whether it's in Pew, PRI, GSS, or Baylor or whatever, they always seem to endorse more reactionary, authoritarian, boundary policing kind of us versus them ideas about politics. I don't know of a survey in which I don't know of one. Like it remains to be seen whether somebody who subscribes more to Christian nationalism in any survey endorses something that most people would consider pro-social and pro-democratic or certainly nothing progressive at all. It is at the core reactionary. Now, notice I said, so that is among white Americans. Among Black Americans, we actually find that it's often associated with more progressive views and values. I'll give you an example of that. I was just showing my students this today, and I'm writing a paper on this that'll hopefully be done within the next week. But we asked Americans on one survey, if society had to make a choice on whether it prioritized liberty or equality. This is a classic tension in all liberal democracies, is liberty and equality. And oftentimes there's a zero-sum exchange that goes on. A society that prioritizes liberty often deprioritizes equality, and if you prioritize equality, you often deprioritize liberty because sometimes they're at odds. And so we asked Americans, which would you prioritize? Which should a society prioritize? We found that, unsurprisingly, the more Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to say that we should prioritize liberty because it's kind of libertarian. It means like liberty, basically liberty for people like us. But there was one group that relationship was flipped, and that was Black women. So the more Black women subscribed to Christian nationalism, the more likely they were strongly to say that we should prioritize equality over liberty. And so what that suggests is that like people who are in historically disadvantaged groups, especially women and Black women especially, are more likely to, Christian nationalism makes them feel like, no, like a Christian nation would be the kind of nation that finally includes me, right? Would be the nation that actually like I am merited full equality. It's not liberty to do whatever I want to do. It's just one that includes me, And so I feel like that's kind of an example, is we often find that among people of color, Christian nationalism often seems to promote more of a civil religious idea of justice, equality, tolerance, and that kind of thing.
Man, that's absolutely fascinating. This whole conversation is fascinating. I mean, we've talked about it on several occasions with several different scholars and academics and people, journalists who have been studying this and learning about it. And the more I learn about it, the more I come to the conclusion that, number one, it has to be talked about. Yeah. It's a very complex subject, which essentially leads into number two, that it's very complex because some people, like you said, can take that. You alluded to earlier, the importance of defining terms and making sure that we don't say, well, anyone who's a Christian and a politician is de facto a Christian nationalist, which would be a really bad thing to do for our nation, for the people around, because we are a land, right, of religious freedom. And we want people, in the sense that we want religion to have impact and influence, but never undue impact and influence on the way that we live our lives in terms of civic responsibilities, in terms of the way that we vote, the policies that are carried out. And this, it's such a, I feel such a tension inside whenever I talk about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one concept here. You know, we're supposed to be Americans that engage with our full selves.
Yep.
Or at least, right, that's kind of the ideal, that everyone can engage equally, and that we would engage with our full selves, bringing that into our actions, our votes, our ideas, our conversations, our discourse. And it's hard for me to think about how faith is supposed to operate in the civic life. Because, like, just for instance, like when I hear you say something like, there's a lot of people, like one of the things they said is that our law should be based on the Bible. You know, and of course, like one part of me was like, well, yeah, there's so much great stuff in the Bible, and the Bible does teach a lot of things, but then that, like in Jesus' teachings, but maybe they're referring to, like, who knows what that actually means, right? Because even saying that's based on the Bible means it's based on a document that's been written over a span of 2,000 years and over 40 authors at least, right? If not more. And so we're finding ourselves like, wait, so which book of the Bible, which interpretation from the Bible, maybe that in part answers the question, but it's like, how do we, what is the appropriate amount? Because all laws we're trying to take, like we make laws, you know, presumably based on some kind of moral standards, or, you know, some kind of even I would want to think of some kind of objective morality, in the sense that we have laws that are going to apply to everyone. We would hope that as best as they can, they should be based in some kind of objective reality about how life works and what's appropriate or inappropriate. And it's hard for me to imagine how to separate those things from our religious views when they're so deeply held. And it's not as if I want a Christian, like, I don't want a law system based off the Old Testament. That would be a very scary thing to live in right now for us to, you know, I don't want that. And yet at the same time, I'm like, where are we getting these, like, the moral basis and foundation for these laws? And I'm not asking you to comment on the legality, like outside of your expertise or anything, you know, that you're comfortable with, but where do you find the balance in bringing our full selves to our civic duties and responsibilities, even elected officers, right? What if we said, well, we don't want anyone we can only elect non-religious people, you know? Well, I don't know how, like, that just seems like it would cut the other way just as much. So how do you kind of feel like the appropriate amount of integration between someone's religious beliefs, which are the core, some of the most deeply held beliefs they have,
right,
and interacting with a very diverse society? Yeah,
well, I think you hit the key at the very end of that, recognizing that we live in a diverse society. I mean, I think we have to proceed, even as Christians who would like to vote our values. Like, I can't take myself out of that, right? Like, I'm also voting my values, and I'd like to think that they are shaped by my personal faith and my belief about what Christians should be like and how Jesus would vote, if that makes any sense. Like, it's like, it's difficult to even kind of
that makes a lot of sense,
those claims. But like, I think if I think we have to at least begin from the reality that we live in a pluralistic society that was really built on the basis of the understanding that there would be diversity in that, like that there would be like and I understand the founding fathers were certainly not universally thinking liberty and equality for all, like in that, but they were. I mean, I think they were thinking, and I think they were right to think this, that there had to be some understanding of, like, at the national level, at the local level, there had to be understanding for the rule of law and equality, legal equality, for people who disagreed with one another. And so, as a Christian, I think those creeds, those national creeds, are actually really good things, and they allow us to live together with one another. So I think any kind of a Christian approach to politics has to begin with the question of, how do I live as a Christian in a society where not everybody is going to agree with me, believe those kinds of things that I believe, and prioritize the kind of things that I prioritize. I think that leads us to a place where we have to have some kind of a balanced pragmatism. And I don't mean pragmatism as in like just whatever is convenient. I mean like a pragmatism that says, like, how can we cooperate in a way that allows us to have effective governance? That includes how can we make sure people aren't starving on the street? How can we make sure that borders are safe, and that we have taxes for everything that we need, and that my curb gets fixed, and all of the kinds of various things.
The potholes in my cul-de-sac.
Right, exactly. And so, like, I think that requires us as Christians to not live in fantasy land, as if that we are going to pass some kind of a series of laws that will bring back Christendom, or that we would even want to create a situation in which people who don't share our religious views either have to leave, or they have to convert, or they just generally feel like unwelcome second-class citizens because we've so dominated. Like we want to be. I mean, I think we have lost something in the last few years. And Joel Regney, who's an author, he writes for various groups. He wrote about, and I couldn't believe he titled it this, but he was talking about kind of living under the progressive gaze, and he used Fanon's idea of, like, white gaze, and how, like, living under the kind of the gaze, he was comparing conservative Christians to, like, minorities who are living under white gaze. And regardless of that, whether I think that was a good comparison, he was talking about how, like, conservative Christians need to stop living in light of progressive gaze. In other words, we need to stop caring about, like, what people think about us and just be obedient. I think it's kind of a justification for just saying screw you, honestly. Like, hey, you liberal, secular leftists don't like us anyway, so we're just going to do what we want. I feel like within the last 2 decades, we as Christians have lost something that I used to think was really important, and that is, like, a public witness. Like I'm leading a men's retreat for my church this Saturday, and I'm kind of talking through various things, and I'm going through various passages in the New Testament where Christians in the epistles are taught to think about their reputation with outsiders. You got things in Colossians 4, you got things in 1 Peter, and all of them have to do with the idea that, like, people are going to be watching us, and they're going to be drawing conclusions about the faith on the basis of your behavior. And the commands are to be characterized by hard work and obedience and faithfulness and ethics and all those kinds of things. And I would like our approach to politics to be one that is actually concerned with witness, not in the way that we, like, shrink and hide back from the things that we believe, but in the ways that we say, man, Christians are great to have in politics because they are ethical, and they care about people,
right.
and
right.
they care about people who are not like them, and they are good Samaritans, yes, and all of those kinds of things, rather than the perception now that we hate people, right? Like that we want to control people. So, I mean, I think there has to be some kind of a balance between, and this is it's an unending conversation. We'll always have these conversations because of Christian Smith, what he calls pervasive interpretive pluralism in the New Testament. Like we all have different interpretations of Scripture. We all have different ways that we prioritize this and that. So I'm not saying we can ever come to, like, I'm not going to write the book that solves all the problems of, like, how Christians in politics. It's an unending conversation, but I would like to think a Christian approach to American society has to proceed under the recognition that we live in a pluralistic society that will become more pluralistic. And so how do we live out a witness and live as Christians in this and do politics well?
That's so awesome. And that really speaks to me because, so we this is a shameless plug. I guess it's not really a plug if you're plugging something in our own podcast, right? But like we just recently released the first episode of our 5-part documentary about Christian nationalism. We've spoken to, I don't know how many people, but basically this documentary, 5 parts, has like over 24 experts that talk about stuff. We kind of break down church and state with folks from the AU and BJC and whatnot. And, Anthea Butler talks about like polygenesis. And anyways, like the last episode was an episode that was really important to me because it was the episode. It's called, gosh, I wish I had that memory. the least of these is love or something like that. I feel like I should know, but it slipped my mind. But anyways, the entire episode sort of unpacks like what we really believe like the Christian witness should be. We've got folks on there like, Shane Claiborne talking about his ministry and, Greg Boyd, who I love, talking about his ministry. And I'm like, look, like this is in my mind, like this is how Christianity should work. Like you don't sort of beat down and, tear down the Capitol because you don't get what you want. You basically just turn the other cheek, and I think that would resonate more with non-believers. But like to that end, I really would love to get your thoughts because this was something that was on the news just recently. A political reporter, Heidi, I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name. Said something on MSNBC that really seemed to get a lot of people kind of up in arms. I don't want to necessarily try to butcher the quote exactly, but she made some comparison about, Christian nationalisms believe that their rights come from like God.
God, yeah.
I don't want to necessarily kind of parse kind of what she said, but what I'd rather hear is like, how should like journalists really be covering this space? Because, there are good journalists that cover this, Brian Kaler, Catherine Stewart, Jenny Cohn, like these are, a lot of independent journalists that do really good work and I read all their stuff. But like when you start getting sort of these more mainstream journalists and they're talking about something like how should they be talking about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think it has to be done with a lot of caution. I think like that was kind of an off the cuff statement. In my understanding of like, and I'm just trying to be generous in the way she said that. I think I don't think it was a very good statement. I think it whether it was in context or out of context, I think I'm not sure how even in context would have made a lot of sense and people really came after her. I do think a lot of the motivation to come after her for that was, at least from the right, as I could perceive it, was just kind of like a look. And every time somebody talks about Christian nationalism, it's just that unfair. It's just like that. And so whenever Perry does it or whoever, it's all just kind of like that. Everybody's a Christian nationalist. So in order to kind of dismiss it as like, hey, this is a nonsense thing, which I think is also unfair. So how should journalists cover it? I think it has to be done with a lot of caution. I think I would stay away personally, I would stay away from just things that you assume people believe when there is actually so many examples of policies that I think people are trying to like make happen and go after. If you want examples of that, like come to Oklahoma. Like we have people in the state legislature in Oklahoma who are running public education in Oklahoma who are outspoken about their Christian nationalism. They will own it. Like Dusty Devers, who is like a state senator here, he actually wrote the statement, like helped write the statement, like a justification for Christian nationalism. He promotes Stephen Wolf's book. These people do not care. Like they will own that kind of thing. So I don't think you have to go looking for it. It's that obvious and that open. I think the Politico argument that came out, or the Politico article that came out just before Heidi Prisbilla's quote, was equally kind of clumsy in this, because they're talking about two guys, William Wolf, who is just a kind of a Twitter troll guy, and then it was the other guy who's also an outspoken Christian nationalist. I can't remember the guy's name. But both of them are outspoken Christian nationalists. They would own the label. But all the quotes that they kind of used from these guys were just kind of basic, like conservative Christian things. And so I just feel like if you're going to make the claim, you got to be real specific with like, this is how this is Christian nationalism. That if you want if you want to make some kind of Christian symbol, like, front and center for everybody to see. If you want to, like, as part of law, if you want to privilege Christianity in some way, if you want to declare that you will take back power for Christians, and Christians, like Trump does, and like he has recently, he says that, like, Christians will have power. You're no longer, there are so many good examples of this explicit Christian nationalism policy that you really just need to kind of like, you need to avoid and be cautious about painting people who might be also concerned about explicit Christian nationalism. So, for example, like when something we all find in our studies is that most Americans are not extreme when it comes to this. Most Americans are not extreme rejectors of this kind of view, and most Americans are not extreme, what we called ambassadors, whatever, minorities. Most Americans are around the middle. They recognize that there's some kind of religious history and heritage here that's good. And most of them are Christians, so they'd like to see more Christianity in government. That'd be a good thing. Christian values and all that, that's fine. But they're not full on kind of like partisans about it. Like and honestly, a lot of them might be horrified by some of the more explicit statements, the kinds of things that you find in a Stephen Wolfe or an Andrew Orba's expression of this idea. And so the last thing I want to do is alienate those people and make them think that leftist, out of touch, elite media people think all of middle America is Christian nationalist and kind of backwoods dupes for this ideology, or they're all kind of cultish, partisan folks. I don't think that's not the case. And so I'd want to be very careful about the examples that I use, the quotes that I use, what I call Christian nationalists and not, so that you can avoid those kinds of assumptions that sometimes are fair, but oftentimes give people on the far right a lot of ammo to say, look, they'll eventually call you all Christian nationalists too. So you might as well just jump forward.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you on that. So what is your hope and what are your biggest concerns? This is my second to last question. The last question will be a quick kind of practical question about how people can find your stuff and things like that. But what's your biggest concern and also conversely your greatest hope for our nation, for this conversation in the next year, 2 years? I mean, obviously we could go out, 20 years, but really let's just focus on the next couple years. What are you concerned about and what are you hopeful for?
I'm mostly concerned that Christian nationalist rhetoric is used in a strategic way to polarize Americans further, to where we continue this, I think, pernicious process of self-sorting into ideological tribes where we don't understand one another. I mean, that's why one of the reasons I agreed to be on the podcast, that I love what you guys are doing, is it's killing our country. Like our inability to understand each other, to talk, to have productive conversations with one another. I think Christians and non-Christians are both a part of the solution and a part of the problem right now. And that is happening. And I don't mean to both sides this in that kind of way. I just mean they're like the sense in which we continue to paint one another in the ugliest possible terms, and we don't even want to be around each other. We don't want to connect. Yeah. We just want to demonize. And I think there is a point where, and I'm perfectly comfortable doing this. There is a point where like bad ideas and bad ideologies need to be called out and say like that's American.
Yes.
Christian, that's wrong. But there's a lot of room in there where like I can just have conversations. And so for my part, what I'm trying to do here is I am a part of, I talked about this earlier, I'm a part of a loosely affiliated SBC church here in Norman, which people who follow me on Twitter may be kind of surprised about to hear. and when I say I'm a part of it, my wife and I lead a community group at this church, and I led a men's Bible study this morning, and I'm leading the men's retreat this weekend. So it's like this matters to me, and those people matter to me. I don't know if any of them agree with me politically, right? We have conversations sometimes, and it's okay. But I know that they know that I love them, and I know that they love me and my family, and our kids play together, and like we talk about things. And so like I would love it if more of that happened. I think we need to kind of dig into those we need to lean into those spaces where we can have conversation with one another. not because we're just supposed to be kind of middle of the road moderates and agree on everything. Sometimes we need to stand up. But I just think the alienation and the polarization is killing us. And when we could just be about the business of like making government work, that'd be awesome. Like I would just love to get back to that.
That absolutely would be.
So
awesome.
that is my fear. My hope is the opposite of that. My hope is that honestly, this rhetoric tanks big time in 2024. That politicians, like in 2022, politicians who used this kind of rhetoric didn't score a lot of electoral victories. And I hope that politicians who use this rhetoric in 24 election, I hope they lose big time, if only to signal to other politicians that this doesn't work, that Americans are tired of it.
Yes.
They'd rather hear about issues and policies. That'd be glorious. So that's my hope.
Yeah. Well, that's really well said. I really appreciate that. How can people keep track of your work, and what do you have in the pike for us?
So you can follow me on Twitter. That's the only social media I'm a part of. And once Elon Musk drives that into the ground, I'm going to take it as God's merciful deliverance from all social media. I'll be gone forever. I think in terms of book, I have a book coming out in the summer called Religion for Realists: Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion. And it basically is a call to try, I think, like why evidence-based kind of investigations into how religion works help us all. Why secular academics need to value religion and study it and not pretend it goes away when you ignore it. And how social scientists like myself can do their jobs better with like being open science and making our data available and all those kinds of things. We want to do science well. And so I think that's a book calling for that.
Well, that's so great. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for being on the show. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Sure. I appreciate you both. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to our listeners and watchers, this has been Dr. Samuel Perry, and we encourage you to pick up all 3 of his books. The third one's coming out this summer, but Taking America Back from God, The Flag and the Cross, and then Religion for Realists.
He has like 5 books.
Yo, gotcha. So get all 5 of them. Get all 5 of them.
Get the whole set.
Yeah. Yes. And until next time, don't keep your conversations left or right, but up. God bless you guys. Have a great day.
Yeah.